Well, welcome to this week's Gospel Video Bible Study. Our text for this Sunday, June 20th, comes at the end of Mark chapter 4. Mark 4 is filled with Jesus' parables, and last week we heard two of them about the kingdom of God being equated to growing crops. And now at the end of the chapter, we hear the story of Jesus' great miraculous deed involving nature. It's the story of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. When chapter 4 begins, Jesus is sitting in a boat just off the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He's in the boat because the crowds coming to see him and listen to him were so large that the only way he could talk to them was to get into a boat, push off from the shore a bit, then sit in the boat and talk to the crowds who were gathered on the shore like a crowd at an outdoor amphitheater gathered there to listen to him. And at the end of the chapter, after telling all his parables about the kingdom of God, we are told that Jesus was still sitting in that boat. It's now evening, and it would seem that Jesus had completed a long day of talking to and teaching the crowds gathered on the shore. He's now tired, and he needs a break. Yes, Jesus got tired and needed breaks. He told his disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And by this he means the other side of the Sea of Galilee. A little background information on the Sea of Galilee. In the Greek of the New Testament, it is actually called a sea, but it's actually more of a large lake. The Sea of Galilee is the largest source of fresh water in Israel. It's the source of the Jordan River, which flows out of its southern end, and the town of Capernaum, where Jesus stayed during most of his ministry, is at the far northern end of the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee covers about 64 square miles. It's roughly 13 miles long and 8 miles wide. And to put this in comparison, Lake Winnebago here in Wisconsin covers 215 square miles. So it is 3 times the size of the Sea of Galilee. We are not talking Mediterranean or Caribbean seas here. But as anyone who has been on a lake of just about any size knows firsthand, when a storm arises, things can get dicey. And that's just what happens in this story. Remember that Jesus' first disciples were fishermen who plied their trade on the Sea of Galilee. They knew the body of water well, and they sailed it often at night and were familiar with what could happen when you are on a boat out on the sea. Jesus wants to go to the eastern side of the sea. He plans to sail to an area called the Gerasenes, or Gassara. And Gassara was one of we call today the Decapolis, which is Greek for 10 cities. It was an area where people of Greek descent and not Jews lived. Jesus has decided that he'll continue his ministry there. Well, the boat with Jesus set sail, and the gospel writer mentions that other boats sailed along with them. But then Mother Nature seems to have had other plans. As the gospel tells us, a great windstorm arose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. This was not a fun situation in which to find oneself, and I'm going to share a story about this in my sermon this week. The wind and the waves were battered the small fishing boat carrying Jesus and his disciples. And you do need to think in terms of a small wooden sailing vessel, about 30 feet long at most. And we know this because back in the mid-1980s, archaeologists actually found a boat like this buried in the silt of the Sea of Galilee during a severe drought. That boat was excavated, and it's now in a museum on the northwest shore of the sea. I saw it when I was there in 2013. It had a single mast and does not appear to have a covered deck with space underneath it. The small boat carrying Jesus was in serious danger. Water was pouring in and filling it. The boat was being swamped. Now, the gospel writer doesn't depict the disciples, Jesus's fishermen friends, valiantly using all their nautical skills to save the small vessel. No, as the story is told, it seems like they are more in a panic. And where was Jesus during all of this? Well, he is in the stern of the boat, his head on a pillow or lying on a cushion, fast asleep. Now, assuming that this boat doesn't have a below deck, Jesus would have been sleeping in the back of an open deck with the waves pounding in the boat and water pouring in. If that's the case, Jesus was indeed a very sound sleeper. His slumber was disturbed by the disciples waking him up none too gently, and I do not imagine them doing it this way. Teacher, excuse me, but we seem to have a bit of a problem here in the middle of the lake, in the middle of a storm. We were wondering if you could maybe get up and lend us a hand. I don't think it went like that. I picture them shaking Jesus violently to wake him up as they screeched in panic-filled voices, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" It was not their best moment. And startled and most likely shaken out of his sleep, Jesus did something rather strange. He yelled. He yelled not at the disciples, but at the wind and the water. "Peace, be still," he said. And as the text tells us, the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. What seems a curious tale to us would have had a much more enormous meaning to the disciples who witnessed it. Because often in ancient religions, the stories of creation centered around the great creator God who created monsters, or who killed the monsters of watery chaos, and from their deaths brought about the creation of the world. For example, the ancient Mesopotamians, they had a story, their creation story was of their chief god whose name was Marduk, slaying the scaly monster of watery chaos named Tiamat, and from Tiamat's dead carcass making the world. The Old Testament even contains images of the God of Israel doing the same thing. Psalm 74, which many scholars think may have actually been based upon an ancient Canaanite psalm, depicts the Lord as destroying the god of chaos, a dragon named Leviathan, and from Leviathan forming the earth. Here's what it says in Psalm 74. "Yet God, my King, is from old working salvation on the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him his food for the creatures of the wilderness." In Genesis chapter 1, the story of creation, there is the voice, the spirit, the breath of God that goes over the primordial waters to bring about creation. God speaks, and the waters of chaos are stilled and divided into something good, creation. Jesus speaks. With a few words, "Peace, be still," he shows the divine power which he possesses. But Jesus doesn't just let the disciples know how amazing and powerful he is. Instead, he addresses the weaknesses of his disciples. "Why are you afraid?" he says in the gospel. "Have you still no faith?" When I teach the youth at Grace, I tell them that in the Bible, the opposite of faith is not disbelief or atheism. No. In the Bible, the opposite of faith is always fear. Fear is what keeps people from trusting God completely. Jesus wonders where his disciples' faith was. Why were they so afraid when they were still with him? You see, at this early time in his ministry, even though his disciples had seen Jesus heal the sick and the crippled, even though they had witnessed evil spirits being driven out by his power, they had not witnessed Jesus demonstrating power over the forces of nature. It was one thing to do miracles, and there were numerous self-possessed miracle workers around in Jesus' time. But someone who could contain the wind and the waves, someone who showed divine power over the forces of nature, well, that was completely new. And the disciples didn't know what to make of it. Jesus was no ordinary teacher, exorcist, or worker of miracles. He was much more than that. He possessed the powers of God. And the text ends with these words, "And they were filled with great awe." The Greek of the gospel text says something much more involved than "they were filled with awe." It says this, "They feared a great fear." They were overwhelmed by Jesus. They say, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They must have said that with hushed, trembling voices. What have we gotten ourselves into, they must have wondered. Just who exactly is this Jesus of Nazareth, I would imagine they asked themselves in shock. They would have a lot more to learn about him in the weeks and months ahead. Jesus of Nazareth was much more than they could imagine. Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him? His disciples will later find out that even death is no match for Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you for joining me for this week's video, and I look forward to seeing you in worship on Thursday or Sunday.